They stole all my clothes. Please help me," begged the obese 8-year-old peasant bathing in the lake. The church bell tolls. A girl's scream echoes over the water. Alone, shivering in the reeds, an 18-year-old peasant begs for mercy as cruel laughter fades into the trees. Her shame burns hotter than the sun, until a solitary farmer steps from the shadows, his coat the only thing between her and ruin. But kindness breeds danger. The village whispers of scandal. Her own father signs her away to the very man who mocked her. And in the dusty square, beneath watchful eyes, a battle of pride, debt, and dignity begins. What happens when a girl mocked as worthless dares to be seen as worthy? And can one man's defiance of gossip and greed save her honor or destroy them both? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. Dawn's gentle light filtered through the budding spring leaves as Elsbeth made her way through the forest path. The morning air still held winter's lingering chill, but hints of warmth promised the day would grow mild. Birds called their morning songs while she walked, clutching her coarse shift and simple towel close to her chest. At 18, these stolen moments were her only taste of true freedom. The weight of village expectations, her father's constant disappointment, and the cruel whispers that followed her through the marketplace made these early morning escapes precious beyond measure. Here, among the trees and wildflowers, she could simply be herself. The hidden pond gleamed like polished silver in the early light. Ancient oaks stood guard around its shores, their branches creating a natural screen. Elsbeth carefully placed her clean clothes and towel on a fallen log, her movements practiced from many such morning visits. The hem of her worn dress brushed against newly sprouting grass as she made her way to the water's edge. Her mother's favorite hymn rose naturally to her lips as she waded in, the cool water embracing her like an old friend. "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound," she sang softly, remembering how her mother's voice had once filled their small cottage with the same melody. For a precious moment, peace settled over her heart like a warm blanket. The harsh sound of breaking branches shattered her solitude. Cruel laughter echoed across the water, turning her blood to ice. Heinrich, the miller's son, emerged from the trees, followed by several village boys who often joined in his meanness. Their faces held the familiar twist of mockery she had grown to dread. "Well, well," Heinrich's voice rang out, sharp with malice. "Look what we've found, lads." The fat miller's daughter, trying to wash away her shame. His companions snickered, emboldened by their leader's cruelty. Elsbeth sank deeper into the water, her arms crossing protectively over her chest. "Please," she whispered, but her soft plea was drowned by their continued laughter. Heinrich strode to the log where she had left her belongings. With a flourish, he snatched up her clean shift and towel. "Shall we see how long she stays in there without these?" He held them high, like trophies of his victory over her dignity. The other boys hooted and called out suggestions, each crueler than the last. "Throw them in the trees," one shouted. "Drop them in the mud," urged another. Tears burned in Elsbeth's eyes as she watched them pass her clothes back and forth, playing a game of keep away with her dignity. "That's enough," the deep voice cut through the laughter like a blade. Arthur Hale stepped out from the tree line, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the morning light. His face, usually stoic and withdrawn, now held a thunderous expression that made the young troublemakers step back. Heinrich, despite his swagger, seemed to shrink under Arthur's stern gaze. The farmer's reputation for strength was well known throughout the village, as was his sense of justice. Even Heinrich's status as the wealthy miller's son offered little protection against Arthur's righteous anger. "I said, that's enough." Arthur's voice remained level, but carried such authority that the boys began backing away. Leave the ladies' things and go home. Now. Heinrich dropped the clothes, trying to mask his fear with a final sneer. Come on, lads. Let's leave the two pigs to wallow. But his words lacked their earlier bite, and he led his followers in a hasty retreat through the trees. Once they were gone, Arthur carefully kept his eyes averted from the pond. He shrugged off his heavy wool coat, the dark fabric still carrying the warmth of his body. With his gaze fixed firmly on the ground, he held it out toward the water. Please. Elsbeth's voice quavered, thick with unshed tears. They stole all my clothes. Please help me. Take my coat, miss, Arthur said gently, still not looking her way. I'll stand guard while you dress. Elsbeth moved cautiously through the water, reaching out to grasp the offered coat. Arthur immediately turned his back, giving her the privacy to emerge and wrap herself in the warm wool. The coat was enormous on her, falling well past her knees, but it offered blessed coverage and comfort. I'll fetch your things, Arthur said once he heard her move away from the water. He collected her scattered belongings from where Heinrich had dropped them, brushing off dirt and leaves, before offering them to her with his eyes still averted. Thank you, Elsbeth whispered, clutching everything close. She felt small and ashamed, yet somehow protected by this quiet man's presence. The walk back to the village seemed endless. Arthur walked beside her, maintaining a respectful distance while ensuring she wasn't alone. His coat enveloped her like armor, though she knew the sight of her wearing it would set tongues wagging throughout the village. Sure enough, as they approached the first houses, curtains twitched and faces appeared in windows. She could already hear the whispers starting. Could imagine the stories that would spread by nightfall. Widow Simmons peered openly from her doorway, her mouth already forming the shapes of gossip she would share at the market. Elsbeth kept her eyes down, focusing on placing one foot in front of the other. Arthur's steady presence beside her was both comfort and concern. His kindness would surely become twisted in the telling, another burden for her to bear. Yet, in this moment, wrapped in the warmth of his coat, and protected by his quiet strength, she felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. They walked in silence through the awakening village, the weight of watching eyes heavy upon them both. The morning sun continued to rise, promising another spring day filled with whispers and judgment. But for now, Elsbeth found herself grateful for this strange moment of grace, even as her cheeks burned with the memory of her humiliation. In the dim light of early morning, Elsbeth's father hunched over their rough wooden table, his weathered fingers tracing the edges of a wrinkled debt notice. The candlelight cast harsh shadows across his face as he muttered calculations under his breath, each sum deepening the lines of worry around his eyes. The miller's demands for payment grew more pressing with each passing week. The door creaked open, letting in a rush of cool morning air. Elsbeth stood in the doorway, her face flushed crimson, swimming in an oversized wool coat that clearly belonged to a man. Her father's head snapped up, his expression darkening as he took in her appearance. "What's this then?" he demanded, rising from his chair. The legs scraped against the wooden floor, with a harsh sound that made Elsbeth flinch. "Whose coat is that? Where have you been?" "Father, Elsbeth's voice trembled as she clutched the coat tighter around herself. "I went to bathe early, before anyone was awake, but Heinrich and his friends." A sharp knock at the door cut off her explanation. Their neighbor, Widow Simmons, burst in without waiting for an invitation, her face alight with scandalous news. "Have you heard?" she asked breathlessly, barely acknowledging Elsbeth's presence. "Heinrich's telling everyone how he caught your daughter trying to seduce Arthur Hale at the pond, in a state of undress, no less." The color drained from Elsbeth's father's face. "What?" "Oh yes," the widow continued, clearly relishing her role as bearer of gossip. Says she was swimming about without a stitch, calling to Arthur like some sort of siren. The whole village is talking about it. That's not true, Elsbeth cried, tears welling in her eyes. Heinrich and his friends stole my clothes while I was bathing. Arthur only helped me. Silence, her father roared, slamming his fist on the table. The empty pewter cups jumped and clattered. Do you have any idea what you've done? Any idea at all? The widow retreated, but left the door open. Through it drifted the sound of villagers gathering, their whispers carrying like poison on the morning air. Father, please, Elsbeth begged. Let me explain. Explain. Explain how you've brought scandal down upon this family, how you've ruined what little standing we had left. His voice rose with each question, years of financial worry and social pressure finally finding their target. We already owe Heinrich's father more than we can hope to repay, and now this wanton behavior. But I didn't. I said silence. He paced the small room like a caged animal. First your mother dies, leaving me with a daughter who eats more than we can afford, who can't find a husband, who now brings shame to our very door. A different knock sounded, firmer this time. Arthur Hale stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling it completely. He'd changed his coat, and his face held the same quiet dignity it always did. Sir, he began, addressing Elsbeth's father directly, I've come to explain what happened this morning. Your daughter was the victim of cruel. Get out. Elsbeth's father's voice was low and dangerous. I'll not have you here, making things worse. Sir, please listen. Heinrich and his friends were tormenting. I said get out. Spittle flew from his lips as he shouted, haven't you done enough? Coming around my daughter like some wolf after fresh meat. She may be worthless to me, but I'll not have her reputation completely destroyed by a lonely widower seeking company. Arthur's face hardened at the insult, but his voice remained steady. You do your daughter a great injustice, sir. She deserves whatever fate brings her now. Get off my property, before I call the constable. Arthur's eyes met Elsbeth's for a brief moment, filled with apology and concern, before he turned and left. The gathered villagers parted before him like water, their whispers following in his wake. The day passed in a blur of tears and accusations. Elsbeth's father alternated between angry silence and bitter tirades about her foolishness. By evening, she sat alone by the hearth, watching the flames dance while trying to make herself as small as possible. Through the thin walls came the sound of her father talking to someone outside. She recognized the oily voice of Heinrich's father, the wealthy miller himself. Of course, we might be able to arrange something, the miller was saying. My son has always had a certain interest in your girl. A quick marriage could quiet these unfortunate rumors. She's brought nothing but trouble, her father replied, his voice heavy with defeat. Better to see her married off quickly, even to Heinrich, than risk complete disgrace. At least then, some of these debts might be forgiven. Elsbeth's heart clenched at his words. She stared into the flames, remembering Heinrich's cruel laughter at the pond, imagining a lifetime of such mockery as his wife. Miles away, in his simple farmhouse, Arthur Hale knelt beside his bed in prayer. The last rays of sunset filtered through his window, painting the room in shades of gold and shadow. His hands were clasped tightly as he wrestled with his conscience. Lord, he whispered, you know I've kept to myself these past years. Since Mary's passing, I've asked nothing more than to work my land in peace. He paused, remembering the look of shame and fear on Elsbeth's face that morning. But I cannot stand by while an innocent girl's reputation is destroyed. I cannot hide in my grief while she suffers. Grant me wisdom, Lord. Show me how to help her, without causing more harm. The only answer was the distant sound of church bells, marking the evening hour, their solemn tones carrying across the darkening fields. Arthur remained on his knees, torn between his instinct to remain uninvolved and his deep-seated sense of justice. The memory of his late wife seemed to watch him from the shadows, her gentle spirit asking what kind of man he would choose to be. Back in the village, Elsbeth pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. As voices continued to murmur outside their small home, she could hear the speculation, the judgment, the gleeful sharing of Heinrich's twisted version of events. The tears had long since dried on her cheeks, leaving behind a hollow ache in her chest. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Better to see her married off quickly, even to Heinrich, than risk complete disgrace. She watched a log split in the fireplace, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny stars seeking escape. Each one seemed to carry with it a piece of her hopes for a different life, one where she might find genuine love and acceptance, rather than cruel mockery and forced marriage to her tormentor. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as darkness settled over the village, bringing no peace with its arrival. Outside, the gossip continued, spinning its web of half-truths and lies, while inside, a young woman's heart grew heavy with the weight of others' judgments and her father's bitter disappointment. The morning sun cast long shadows across the village square as Elsbeth made her way toward the church well, wooden bucket swinging heavily from her hand. Her steps were slow, weighed down by more than just the empty pail. Each window she passed seemed to hold watching eyes, each whispered conversation dying as she drew near only to resume more fervently once she'd gone by. Near the well, Arthur Hale stood with his own bucket, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the cobblestones. He shifted uncertainly when he saw her, and Elsbeth nearly turned back, her cheeks burning with remembered shame. But the house needed water, and she could not avoid the well forever. "Good morning, Miss Elsbeth," Arthur said softly as she approached. His voice carried none of the mockery she'd grown used to hearing. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," she murmured, keeping her eyes on the well's worn stones. He began, then fell silent, searching for words. Finally, he spoke again, his voice gentle but firm. "No one deserves the treatment you've received, least of all from those who should protect you." Elsbeth's hands trembled on the well's rope. "You need not concern yourself, sir. The gossip will die down eventually, will it?" Arthur asked quietly. "Or will Heinrich and his father continue their torments until they've broken your spirit entirely?" A tear splashed onto the well's edge, quickly absorbed by the ancient stone. Arthur continued, his words careful and measured. "I have a proposal, miss. My farm needs tending, the cows want milking, the hens need feeding, and the house." He glanced down briefly. "Well, it's been too long since a woman's touch brought order there. I offer you honest work, fair wages, and most importantly, protection from those who would harm you." Elsbeth's heart thundered in her chest. "You would hire me, after all the rumors?" "I know the truth of what happened at the pond," Arthur said firmly. "And I know a good heart when I see one, regardless of what others might say." She twisted the rope in her hands, mind racing. The offer was both salvation and danger. Working for Arthur would only feed the gossip, yet staying home meant facing Heinrich's increasing advances and her father's growing desperation. I must think on it," she whispered finally. Arthur nodded gravely. "Of course, the offer stands when you need it." The church bells began to toll, calling the village to Sunday service. Elsbeth hurriedly filled her bucket and hurried home to change, aware of the eyes following her every move. Inside the church, the wooden pews creaked with the weight of the congregation. Elsbeth sat beside her father, feeling the heat of disapproving stares burning into her back. The preacher's sermon seemed to linger particularly long on the subjects of propriety and reputation, his stern gaze sweeping across the assembled villagers. When the service ended, Elsbeth found herself near Arthur as they filed out of the church. He touched his hat politely as he passed, a simple gesture of respect that nonetheless set the village wives whispering furiously behind their prayer books. The preacher watched this exchange from the church steps, his lined face creased with concern. Though he said nothing, his frown spoke volumes about the impropriety of such familiar acknowledgment between an unmarried woman and a widowed man. That evening, as Elsbeth helped prepare their simple supper, her father burst through the door, his face mottled with rage. "What's this I hear about Arthur Hale offering you work?" he demanded, throwing his cap onto the table. "Have you lost what little sense you possess?" "Father, please," Elsbeth began. "It's honest work with fair pay." "Honest work," he spat. "The whole village already whispers about you too, and now you'd go live under his roof. I forbid it. You'll not bring more shame to this family." "But father..." "No. You'll stay here where I can watch you. And that's final." He slammed his fist on the table, making the dishes rattle. "Heinrich's father has spoken to me about settling our debts through marriage. It's more than you deserve, given your behavior." Elsbeth's protest died in her throat as heavy footsteps approached their door. Without knocking, Heinrich himself stumbled in, reeking of ale from the tavern. "Speaking of marriage," he slurred, leering at Elsbeth, "I've come to claim my bride-to-be." "Heinrich," her father began, "this isn't the proper time." "Proper time?" Heinrich laughed cruelly. "Since when has your daughter cared about proper? Swimming naked, tempting honest men." He took a stumbling step toward Elsbeth, who backed away in terror. "But don't worry, I'll have her anyway. What other man would want her now?" Elsbeth's heart pounded as Heinrich advanced, his ale-soaked breath hot on her face. Her father stood frozen, torn between protecting his daughter and appeasing his creditor's son. In that moment of paralysis, Elsbeth made her choice. She ducked under Heinrich's grasping hands and fled through the door into the gathering darkness. Behind her, she heard Heinrich's drunken laughter and her father's angry shouts, but she didn't stop running. The path to Arthur's farm was long and dark, lit only by the quarter moon overhead. Branches caught at her skirts, and stones turned beneath her feet, but still she ran, tears streaming down her face. Finally, the bulk of Arthur's farmhouse loomed before her, a single candle burning in the window. Her trembling fist barely made a sound against the heavy door, but it opened almost immediately. Arthur stood in the doorway, candlelight flickering across his grave face, as he took in her disheveled appearance and tear-stained cheeks. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Arthur stepped aside, candlelight spilling out into the darkness, like a beacon of hope. "Then stay here," he said simply, his voice deep and sure. "You shall be safe." The pale light of dawn crept through the small window of Arthur's farmhouse, painting the worn floorboards with gentle stripes of gold. Elsbeth stirred on the simple cot Arthur had set up for her in the kitchen, the borrowed shift from his late wife's chest soft against her skin. The fabric held a faint scent of lavender, carefully preserved through the years by dried sprigs tucked between folded linens. A chorus of roosters announced the morning, their calls echoing across the farmyard. Elsbeth sat up, smoothing the shift with trembling hands. The reality of her situation settled over her like morning dew. She had fled her father's house, sought refuge with a widower, and now must prove herself worthy of the protection offered. Heavy footsteps crossed the floor above, followed by the creak of stairs. Arthur appeared, already dressed for the day's work in sturdy brown clothes, his face freshly washed. "Good morning," he said quietly, averting his eyes from her in her night clothes. There's a dress of Mary's that might suit you for working, in the chest upstairs, if you wish to change. Elsbeth nodded gratefully, waiting until he stepped outside before hurrying up to find it. The dress was simple wool, well made but plain, clearly chosen for practicality rather than beauty. It fit well enough, though the previous owner had been taller. Elsbeth cinched the waist with a length of ribbon and hurried down to begin her first day of honest work. Arthur waited by the barn door, 2 wooden pails in hand. "We'll start with the milking," he said, leading her inside where 4 cows stood in their stalls, watching them with lazy interest. "Have you milked before?" "No, sir," Elsbeth admitted, flushing, "but I learn quickly." He demonstrated the proper technique, his strong hands making quick work of the task. "Gentle but firm," he explained. "The cows must trust you." Elsbeth settled onto the small stool, positioning her pail as she'd seen him do. Her first attempts were clumsy, producing only a thin stream of milk. The cow shifted restlessly, and Elsbeth bit her lip in concentration. "Like this," Arthur said quietly, showing her again. "Don't rush. Let your hands find the rhythm." Gradually, she began to understand the motion. The sound of milk hitting the pail grew stronger, more consistent. A small smile of triumph crossed her face as she finished her first cow. "Well done," Arthur nodded. 3 more to go. By the time they finished the milking, Elsbeth's hands ached, but pride warmed her chest. They carried the heavy pails to the house, where Arthur showed her how to strain the milk and set it properly for cream to rise. "Next, the hens need feeding," he said, leading her to the feed bin. "Scatter it widely so all can reach it." Elsbeth took the basket of grain, watching how the chickens followed Arthur trustingly. When she attempted to feed them, however, they scattered in alarm at her unfamiliar presence. "They'll learn to know you," Arthur assured her, seeing her disappointment. "Chickens are creatures of habit. Give them time." As she scattered the feed, Elsbeth noticed the henhouse door hanging askew on its hinges. The chickens were pushing through the gap, threatening to escape into the wider yard where foxes might find them. "The door," she began hesitantly. "Might I try to fix it?" Arthur paused in his own work of checking eggs. "You know carpentry?" "No, but..." She studied the problem. "If we weave a length of rope through these holes here and here, we could draw the door straight again, like lacing a shoe." Arthur's eyebrows rose slightly. He handed her a length of rope without comment, watching as she threaded it carefully through the existing holes in the wood. With a few careful knots, she pulled the door back into alignment. "Simple, but clever," he said finally. "It will hold until I can make proper repairs." Elsbeth ducked her head at praise, but pleasure bloomed in her chest. This was so different from her father's constant criticism, from Heinrich's cruel mockery. Here, her efforts were noted and valued. The morning passed in a blur of new tasks. Arthur showed her how to gather kindling and stack firewood properly, how to tell which eggs were fresh and which needed checking before use. Her arms trembled with the unaccustomed work, but she pressed on, determined to prove her worth. By the time evening approached, Elsbeth had learned more practical skills than in all her previous 18 years. She helped prepare a simple supper of bread, cheese, and soup, setting it on the scrubbed wooden table. As the last light faded outside, Arthur settled into his chair with a quiet sigh of weariness. Then, to Elsbeth's surprise, he folded his hands and bowed his head. "Lord," he began, his voice rough with disuse, "we thank thee for thy bounty." He paused, as if the long unused words caught in his throat. "And for thy mercy," Elsbeth continued softly, her own hands clasped, "for shelter in storm and guidance in darkness." Arthur's head lifted slightly, but he joined her in completing the prayer. "Amen." For a moment, Neither spoke. The simple act of grace hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Elsbeth realized this was likely the first time since his wife's death that Arthur had spoken prayers aloud at his own table. They ate in comfortable silence, the fire crackling in the hearth. After the dishes were cleared and washed, Elsbeth settled in her chair by the fire to mend a torn apron she'd found. Without conscious thought, she began to hum the hymn her mother had taught her, the one that always brought her peace. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. The familiar melody filled the quiet room. Arthur sat motionless in his chair, firelight reflecting in his eyes. As they grew suspiciously bright, the hymn spoke of being lost and found, of grace leading home, words that seemed to bridge the distance between them, between past and present, between loss and hope. Elsbeth's voice faded into silence. For a long moment, only the pop and crackle of the fire could be heard. Then Arthur rose, his movements deliberate, as he went about extinguishing the candles one by one. Neither spoke, but in the growing darkness, something had shifted, like a door long rusted shut beginning, ever so slightly, to ease open. The market day dawned clear and crisp, with morning dew sparkling on the grass like scattered diamonds. Elsbeth helped Arthur load the cart with eggs, cheese, and early spring vegetables from his kitchen garden. Her movements were more confident now after 2 days of farm work, though her muscles still ached pleasantly from the unaccustomed labor. Arthur handed her up onto the wooden seat before climbing up himself. The cart creaked as he settled beside her, taking up the reins. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Elsbeth nodded, adjusting her plain wool dress, another from Mary's chest, carefully mended. "Yes, sir." They set off down the rutted road toward town, the cart swaying gently. The morning air was sweet with wild flowers, and birds called from the hedgerows. Elsbeth found herself relaxing despite her nervousness about facing the townspeople. As they approached the market square, however, her anxiety returned. Heads turned to watch their arrival, and whispers followed them like autumn leaves in the wind. Elsbeth kept her eyes lowered, focusing on helping Arthur unload their goods onto the rough wooden stall. "Look there," she heard one woman mutter to another. The widow's farmhand, acting far too familiar with her master, no proper sense of her place at all. "Shameless," came the reply. "After that business at the pond, too, makes one wonder what really happened that morning." Elsbeth's cheeks burned, but she continued arranging their wares with trembling hands. Arthur's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, helping her set out the last of the eggs. The morning wore on, with customers approaching cautiously to examine their goods. Some bought with averted eyes, while others passed by with pointed sniffs. Elsbeth focused on making careful change and wrapping purchases neatly, trying to ignore the constant murmurs. Near midday, a familiar voice cut through the market's busy hum. Well, if it isn't the farmer and his new cow." Heinrich stood there, clearly having enjoyed too much ale despite the early hour. His fine clothes were rumpled, and his face was flushed as he gestured mockingly toward Elsbeth. "Tell me, Hale," he called loudly, drawing attention from nearby stalls, "how much did you pay for this one? Though I suppose even a cow of a girl might seem fair company after so long alone." Elsbeth's hands clutched the edge of the stall, her knuckles white. Arthur stepped forward, his face dark with controlled anger, his fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his voice steady. "You will never speak of her thus again," he said, each word precise and heavy with warning. "Never." Heinrich's smile faltered slightly at the deadly quiet in Arthur's tone, but the ale gave him false courage. "Or what, farmer? Will you attack the miller's son in broad daylight? That would make a fine tale indeed." "I need not lower myself to violence," Arthur replied evenly. Your own words show clearly what manner of man you are. Now go, before I forget my Christian charity." Something in Arthur's stance must have penetrated Heinrich's drink-addled mind, for he backed away, trying to cover his retreat with a harsh laugh. "Keep your cow then. She was never worth the trouble anyway." Elsbeth blinked back tears as whispers rippled through the watching crowd. She felt Arthur's gentle hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "Pay him no mind," he murmured. "His words cannot touch your true worth." Before she could respond, a somber figure in black approached their stall. The village preacher's lined face was grave as he gestured Arthur aside. "A word, if you please, Master Hale." Arthur squeezed Elsbeth's shoulder once before following the preacher to a quiet corner of the square. Though they spoke in low voices, Elsbeth could see the tension in Arthur's bearing as he listened. "The girl's presence in your home causes talk," the preacher was saying, his hands clasped before him. "Heinrich's father has expressed concern about the propriety of the arrangement." "Has he indeed?" Arthur's tone was dry. "The same man who allows his son to terrorize innocent girls at their bath." The preacher sighed heavily. "The miller holds considerable influence in our community, and he is not wrong that appearances must be considered. A young woman, living unchaperoned with a widower, it invites scandal. She has nowhere else to go," Arthur protested. "Would you have me turn her out to face Heinrich's persecution alone?" "There are other solutions. The miller's wife has cousins in the next town who might take her in as a servant. For the girl's own reputation, you must see that dismissing her would be wisest." Arthur was silent for a long moment, watching Elsbeth as she helped a customer wrap a cheese in cloth. "No," he said finally. "I gave her my word of protection. I'll not break it for fear of wagging tongues." "Consider carefully, my friend," the preacher warned. "Your own reputation may suffer." "Then let it suffer," Arthur replied firmly. "Good day to you, Reverend." He returned to the stall, his face troubled but resolved. They finished their business quietly, packing up as the afternoon shadows lengthened. The ride home was silent, each lost in their own thoughts as the cart bumped along the familiar road. Only, when they reached the farmyard did Elsbeth speak, her voice small. "I heard what the preacher said. Perhaps he's right. I bring you nothing but trouble." Arthur turned to her, his eyes serious in the fading light. "Do not say such things. You have brought more life and purpose to this farm in 3 days than I've known in years." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You have more dignity in your little finger than Heinrich has in his whole body. Never doubt that." Tears spilled down Elsbeth's cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak. They worked together to unload the cart and settle the animals for the night as dark clouds gathered overhead. The storm broke just after sunset, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling around the eaves. Arthur and Elsbeth moved through the house by candlelight, checking that all was secure. "This shutter's loose," Elsbeth called from the kitchen window, struggling with the heavy wood panel as it banged in the wind. "Here, let me help." Arthur reached around her, his broad hands joining hers on the shutter. Together they forced it closed, fingers brushing as they slid the iron bolt home. For a moment they stood there, close enough that Elsbeth could feel the warmth of him at her back, could smell the clean scent of soap and wool that clung to his clothes. The candlelight cast their shadows large against the wall, merged into one dark shape. Neither moved to step away immediately. The storm raged outside, but in that moment, the kitchen felt like the warmest, safest place in all the world. The church bells rang clear across the morning air as Arthur and Elsbeth walked together toward the whitewashed building. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting rainbow patterns through the glass onto the worn wooden pews. As they entered, the usual gentle murmur of pre-service conversation died away, replaced by pointed whispers and stares. They took their seats near the back, but distance offered no protection from the scrutiny. Heinrich's voice suddenly cut through the hushed atmosphere, loud and deliberate. How generous of Master Hale to bring his housemaid to worship, he drawled, emphasizing the word with cruel suggestion, though perhaps kept woman would be more honest. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the congregation. The preacher half rose from his chair, but before he could speak, Arthur stood, his tall frame casting a shadow down the aisle. "I have held my peace long enough," he said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner. "You mock what you do not understand. Dignity comes not from wealth, nor from a slim figure, but from the worth of one's soul before God, and He sees clearly who among us truly honors His teachings." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, soft but clear, Elsbeth's voice rose in song, the hymn her mother had taught her. The pure notes filled the church, carrying all the pain and hope within her heart. Several women dabbed at their eyes as the last note faded away. As they left the church afterward, some villagers turned pointedly away, but others offered respectful nods. Arthur walked with his head high, and Elsbeth beside him felt her heart flutter with newfound hope. In the dim light of a single candle, Elsbeth's father hunched over his rough wooden table, his weathered face drawn with worry. Across from him sat Heinrich and his father, the wealthy miller, their shadows looming large against the wall. Between them lay a crisp parchment, its official seal gleaming in the candlelight. "Sign it," Heinrich's father commanded, sliding the document forward. "Your debts will be forgiven, and your daughter will have a proper marriage." With trembling fingers, Elsbeth's father dipped the quill in ink, his signature scratched across the paper, each stroke weighted with desperation. Heinrich's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Finally, the fat dove will be mine," he sneered, reaching for his cup of ale. "Before the week ends, I'll have her honor, willing or not." Miles away at Arthur's farm, hoofbeats approached in the darkness. A messenger delivered a sealed notice, bowing stiffly before departing. Arthur broke the seal, his face growing darker with each line he read. "They cannot do this," he growled, hands shaking, as he showed Elsbeth the document. "Your father has signed your hand to Heinrich." Elsbeth collapsed into a chair, tears streaming down her face. "Then I am ruined," she whispered. "The law gives him rights over me now." Arthur's fist crashed against the wooden table, making the candlelight dance wildly. "By God's grace," he declared, his voice fierce with determination, "I will not let them take you without a fight." The morning sun had barely risen when Arthur led his horse from the stable, its breath visible in the cool dawn air. He helped Elsbeth onto the cart, tucking a woolen blanket around her shoulders, before climbing up himself. The betrothal papers lay heavy in his coat pocket as they set out for the village magistrate's house. Inside the magistrate's stuffy office, Arthur spread the documents across the polished desk. The older man adjusted his spectacles, studying each page with careful attention. "The contract appears properly drawn and witnessed," the magistrate declared, his expression grave. "By law, it binds the lady to marriage unless contested before the church court." He paused, stroking his chin. "There is one other way. A special license marriage could override the betrothal, but it requires public declaration before witnesses and payment of substantial fees." Elsbeth's face paled at his words. The thought of standing before the entire village, enduring their whispers and judgment, made her hands tremble in her lap. Tears threatened to spill from her eyes. Arthur turned to her, his voice gentle but firm. "Listen to me, Elsbeth. I swear before God Himself, I will defend your name and honor. Whatever the cost may be, you need not face this alone." As evening settled over the farmhouse, Arthur knelt beside his bed, hands clasped in earnest prayer for strength and guidance. In the next room, Elsbeth sat in the flickering candlelight, her own whispered prayers rising like incense, begging for deliverance from her father's cruel bargain. The village square buzzed with whispers as Heinrich stood before the gathering crowd, a self-satisfied smile playing across his face. His fine coat gleamed in the morning sun as he prepared to stake his claim on Elsbeth, who stood trembling beside her father. "Stop!" Arthur's voice rang out across the square. He strode forward, his weathered face set with determination. "I declare my intent to marry Elsbeth with proper banns. I will pay her father's debt with the worth of my own land." Heinrich's father pushed through the crowd, his face red with fury. "The debt is mine to collect. I hold the papers." The village preacher stepped forward, pulling documents from his sleeve. "These papers tell a different tale." His stern voice carried across the hushed square. "See here the alterations. Amounts changed. Dates modified. The ink is fresh. The numbers falsified." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Heinrich's father stumbled backward, his face draining of color as villagers turned accusing eyes upon him. Heinrich, stripped of his arrogance, stood slack-jawed and silent. Arthur moved to Elsbeth's side, taking her hand in his. His voice softened but remained clear and strong. "I love this woman, and I am not ashamed to declare it before God and all assembled here." The church bells began to peal, their joyful sound echoing across the square as the preacher raised his hands. "I hereby announce the banns of marriage between Arthur Hale and Elsbeth Miller." The congregation murmured in amazement, watching as Arthur squeezed Elsbeth's hand, his eyes shining with tender affection. The church overflowed with villagers on that bright Sunday morning, the third since the banns were first read. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting a gentle glow upon Arthur Hale as he stood tall and dignified at the altar. His best wool coat had been carefully pressed, and though his hands were work-roughened, they were scrubbed clean for this sacred day. A hush fell over the congregation as Elsbeth appeared in the doorway. She wore a simple gown of cream-colored wool, adorned with sprigs of fresh wild flowers. Though not the finest dress in the village, it suited her perfectly, and her face glowed with quiet joy as she walked down the aisle. The preacher's voice rang clear through the hushed church as he joined their hands. "What God has brought together, let no man put asunder," he intoned solemnly. Though some whispers still rustled in the back pews, many villagers smiled warmly, touched by the evident love between bride and groom, and moved by their steadfast courage in the face of opposition. Later, at Arthur's farmhouse now their shared home neighbors gathered to celebrate. The rough-hewn table groaned under platters of fresh bread, wheels of cheese, and pitchers of ale. The atmosphere was markedly different from the tension of recent weeks. Where once there had been scorn, now there was acceptance. Where there had been whispers of scandal, now there were congratulatory toasts. Arthur stood proudly beside his bride, his arm wrapped protectively around her waist. "Under this roof," he promised softly, his voice thick with emotion, "you'll never know shame again. Here you'll find only love and respect." As evening settled over the farm, the newlyweds sat together on their porch, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. The cool night air carried the scent of spring blossoms, and in the distance, a nightingale sang. Before them stretched their future days of honest labor and nights of peaceful companionship. Though the work would be hard, they would face it together, their love having proven stronger than prejudice, their dignity restored through unwavering faith in each other. Thanks for taking a moment to feel with me. If this story reminded you of what matters, hit subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow, continuing our story.